The theme of today's episode is well-being. My guest is Dr. Parneet Pal. Parneet is an amazing human being. She's a medical doctor, dedicated not to disease care, but health creation. She is Chief Science Officer of Wisdom Labs. She has directed clinics. She's directed executive health programs. She has degrees from Columbia and Harvard. She's absolutely a spectacular person. As we enter the new year, we're probably all dealing with the dietary aftermath of the holidays and making resolutions that we'll probably forget in about a month or two. But I wanted to talk to her about what do we really need to know about well-being, about weight loss and good health. But I wanted to go beyond the normal conversation to tap into something larger that's also an interest of Parneet's, which is the health of the planet. So after all, what good is it to be a healthy person on a sick planet? So she gives us a framework that I think will frankly blow your mind. What's also very clear is that Parneet knows a lot about human biology, and that you'll hear that right away. What I think is powerful about her knowledge is that the topics we'll discuss can be to some ears kind of woo-woo, but her vast knowledge gives a solid biological foundation that paints not just a convincing picture, but one that might change how you see yourself and the world around you. So join me in my conversation with Parneet Pal. This is the first of 2 episodes we'll have. Hi, this is Jeremy Hunter. Welcome to Untaught Essentials. This is episode 5. My guest, Parneet Pal. The purpose of this podcast is to explore like fundamental themes of things that you need to know, and in the themes that we've explored so far, death, money, love, have been all very interesting, and we haven't yet had a conversation on health, or for that matter, ecology. And I thought Parneet is the perfect person to have those 2 conversations wrapped into one. And so I want to introduce my friend Parneet, Dr. Parneet Pal, actually. And she's a medical doctor and, among other things, the Chief Science Officer of Wisdom Labs, which is very well regarded organization in Silicon Valley, helping organizations in their workforce health and well-being. But Parneet, why don't you say a little bit about you and your very interesting life so far?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much, Jeremy, for having me. I love talking to you, so it's an absolute pleasure to be part of this podcast. And I also really appreciate this idea that you have of focusing on health, because I think, especially now after the pandemic, I think that's top of mind for a lot of folks. And for me, that's a really good thing, because health and well-being has been top of mind for me for my entire career. Mm-hmm. So just by way of background, as you mentioned, I trained as a physician. I grew up in India, where I went to medical school. Then I came to the States for my specialization. And I was really lucky to get into amazing programs at Columbia and at Harvard. But what I realized by the end of my medical training was that all of the conversation and everything that we were being taught was focused on treating people when they were really, really sick. So that was one end of the health and disease spectrum. There was very little conversation on the preventative side. So how do you help people stay well? And also when you take a look at the statistics around health and disease globally, we find that most of our healthcare dollars go towards treating chronic lifestyle-related diseases. So these are things like obesity and diabetes and cancer and heart disease, autoimmune disorders, mood disorders. And but when you also, sort of the good part of that data is that most of these diseases are completely preventable when we pay attention to our lifestyle. So what we eat, how we move, how we sleep, and how we manage our stress. And so that when I came across that statistic that 80 to 90% of these disorders are completely preventable, for me that was really empowering. And so my career has really focused on the intersection of using this kind of knowledge through lifestyle medicine, how it intersects with technology and how it intersects with behavior change. Because what I found through my work, because I decided not to move ahead with clinical practice, but instead focus on prevention and specifically the business of well-being. And so I directed wellness spas and executive health practices and designed well-being programs before I joined Wisdom Labs as a chief science officer, focusing on mental and emotional well-being. I think through this whole career trajectory, one thing that really stood out for me was that firstly, there's a lot of misinformation out there about health and what keeps you healthy. So one of my passions is to communicate that clearly, to make the science easy to understand, but also interesting and fascinating, because I think the human body is one of the most awe-inspiring systems. But then the other part is also understanding that just knowing, just the knowledge is not enough. Behavior change takes so much more than just knowing the content. And I was very interested in understanding the science of behavior change and then how we could scale that using technology. And then, the final thing that I'll say that you mentioned is, I think in the past decade, as sort of the conversation around the climate crisis has been coming to the fore, I was very interested in it, just for, getting to know what was going on in the world. But for me, I was beginning to see the connections between our lifestyle and the health of the planet. And so I think, I would just summarize my interest in saying, I'm really interested in understanding the science of well-being. And by well-being, I mean both our physical and mental health, but also its connections to planetary health.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And I want to definitely dig into that. I mean, it's no use being a healthy person on a planet that's sick, right? Or vice versa. So, and those are connections that aren't necessarily immediately obvious to people, as they roll their cart down the aisle of the grocery store, right? And so let's start with the personal first, and the real pragmatic, right? I also worked at an executive health clinic for some time, and one of the things that we would talk about is that, at least in the United States, like enormous percentage of your weight gain happens between November and New Year's, right? Because of all the stuff we eat. And so I'm sure, at least at this moment, which is the early January 2021, there are a lot of people listening or watching that have gone through that gauntlet of carbohydrates and sugar and whatnot. And what should a person think about if they're in that situation and they're looking ahead to their kind of New Year's resolutions, which we usually forget by the end of February anyway. But what are the fundamentals of creating health? Rather than, I like what you said in terms of the majority of the health system is really a disease system, and it's intervening in the body really late in the game when it's also very expensive to do so. And the focus around prevention, not only disease prevention, but health creation, I think is something that very few people really get a solid exposure to, because I've noticed that in say men's magazines or women's magazines, they're kind of driven by fads to sell this month's issue. But I think it would be really valuable to have a framework for how do you actually create health, right? Rather than either prevent disease or treat disease. Like what should a person do?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. So I think at this time when people are in January and maybe they've put on some weight, so just from a very practical standpoint, I think my first message is there's a lot of hope. So my message is always one of empowerment. So no matter where you find yourself in the process, and even if you're feeling maybe guilty about what you've eaten or what your weight might be at this point, I think hopefully once you understand the framework, it will give you a sense of agency to take better control of your health. So the way I like to understand health is for us to just take a step back and get away from thinking about our body and our mind as the siloed structure in space. And I think the most important thing is to realize is that we are a system. Our body is an ecosystem in itself, and I'll get into the details of that in a bit. But we are also part of this bigger ecosystem, which is our planet. And it also really helps to think about our evolution. So through millions of, millennia as hunter-gatherers out in the wild, Mother Nature designed an incredibly intelligent system within our bodies to help optimize health. And so what happened was, as hunter-gatherers, we had to get acclimated to the Earth's rotation, right? So 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. And we also had to be out and about getting food, and we had to be really active. And there was sort of this uncertainty about, when we might be able to come upon food, whether that was any animal food or mostly the plant foods that we were foraging for. And so our body developed in such a way to coordinate both our growth processes, so our anabolic processes, things that build our muscle and other organs and systems, versus our rest and repair systems, which are equally important. And so it makes sense to do all of the anabolic or the growth processes during the daytime when we're awake and we're eating food. And then in the night when it's dark and you're not able to do all of those activities, you sleep and you restore your body. So this is sort of the basic underlying mechanism of what's called a circadian rhythm. So we've developed this amazing rhythm, biorhythm in our body that moves in sync with the biorhythm of the earth around us. And so just very broadly, when we wake up in the morning, so our circadian rhythms are synced to light and food. Those are the two main triggers. And so these 12-hour cycles usually come into play in the morning. So the first bright light that hits our eye, and I can go into as much detail as you want, but basically it stimulates what's called this master clock, which is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is sort of the area in the brain behind where the two optic nerves cross. And so we have these light receptors called melanopsin in our retina. And so this first bright light that hits our eyes, that signal goes to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is sort of the master circadian clock. And this is located close to the hypothalamus in the brain, which is a part of the brain that regulates our sleep-wake cycles, our hunger and our thirst, our body temperature, but also all of our hormonal systems. And so as you can imagine, these stimuli, they sort of trigger these systems which come into play, which means all of these hundreds of thousands of metabolic reactions that are occurring in our cells, the hormone systems in our body. And then it turns out, and by the way, all of this is information and research based on Dr. Sachin Panda's work. And he's a research scientist at the Salk Institute. So I would highly recommend people to go to his site and check out his work. It's been pretty revolutionary. And it turns out that not only do we have this master clock, every one of our organ systems, so our gut, our liver, our heart, our lungs, our muscles, our immune system each have their own internal clock and rhythm as well. And by these clocks, what I mean is that, how our genes in these cells are expressed. When do these genes come on? And genes code for proteins that are important for our growth and repair. And when do they turn off? So if you think of it, it's like this beautiful orchestra in the body. And you can think of the suprachiasmatic nucleus as sort of the conductor of this symphony and orchestra. And once it gets into motion, it sends out the signal, all the body systems come into play during the day. We eat food, we take in that food, and our system is optimized at that time to use these fuel substrates really efficiently and turn that into energy. Ultimately, that's the whole point, is that we take the fuel substrates and transfer that into energy for growth. And then at nighttime, sort of the reverse happens. So, when it starts to get dark, the melatonin levels rise in our brain, which triggers our brain to start getting in, sleeping and resting. Our cortisol levels go down, which means we're less awake and alert, and we're priming our bodies to sleep. But then very importantly, all those systems and genes that were active during the day for growth, they turn off. And then we have a whole new set of rhythm in all of these organ systems around repair and restoration. And this repair and restoration is essential. It's essential for cancer prevention. It's essential for our immunity. It's essential for our cognitive health. And so it's this beautiful sort of symphony that's taking place. And the food that we eat, what we eat and when we eat has a huge impact on these rhythms. And so I think once we start to understand these rhythms, everything falls into place. So then we know why we need to wake up at a certain time or be active at a certain time, or what is the impact of certain kinds of foods on these rhythms. So anything lifestyle-wise that is sort of out of sync with these rhythms is what creates confusion, right? These clocks, these cells and these metabolic reactions that are taking place, they get confused. They're like, wait a second, I thought I was supposed to be on right now, but because you're, reading, with a bright light at 2 a.m., I'm a little confused because I'm not supposed to be on right now. Or maybe I'm eating this kind of refined, processed food, which is really upsetting the microbiome balance in my gut, which is not supposed to happen right now. So anyway, so it's this chaos and confusion which ultimately result in metabolic outcomes. And here it's really fascinating because when we look at all of these chronic lifestyle related diseases, again, they have this common denominator. It usually starts with a decrease in our insulin sensitivity, which is sort of, which upsets our glucose regulation. And that is the foundation and a risk factor for heart disease, stroke, for cancer, and neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So again, there's sort of this common theme of this metabolic upset that's happening because of the disruption of these rhythms. So that's the basic framework. And I think the only other thing I'll add is that, as I said, we are not alone in this. We only have 23,000 genes in the human genome. And we have 10 times the number of microbial cells than human cells. And so we have evolved over millions of years along with the bacteria, fungi, viruses, and parasites on our skin, in our mouth, in our entire gut system. Now we're finding that there are microbes in other organs as well. And they're there for a reason. The genetic information in these microbes are expressed to our advantage. So they are the ones, they play a key role in our digestion, in our immune system, in our brain health. And so it's to our advantage to then make sure that we are encouraging a diversity of these organisms in our body, and we are feeding them appropriately. So I'll take a pause there because I know that was a lot.
I mean, first of all, I have never heard an understanding of the human body and human functioning expressed in that way, right? That we're living in cycles, right? And that the body's a series of cycles. The body systems have their own cycles, and and as you painted this picture of all of these kind of intertwined systems kind of coming on during the day, and then as the day goes, as the day passes, they kind of slowly turn off and shift mode as we move into night, and that there's an active element to that, and then there's a restive element to that. And it's so simple, and it's so, in a way, so obvious because it's happening all around us all the time.
Exactly.
Right? And yet why that is not like, here's how to understand the human body 101 that everybody should just have a fundamental understanding of is kind of a mystery, right? And then what I heard is that it is not just, I mean, this is the thing that I find so fascinating about the body too, right? That the body isn't just you in there, but you're kind of a walking community of microorganisms that are supporting you. And I can remember as a kid seeing videos where I think they had first discovered this, of like these little tiny microscopic, what look like little insects, are crawling all over your body or doing something like that. And it was so weird, but we are really a host. What I heard you say is that the body is a host to a community of organisms that is supporting our existence. And do we take care of those organisms in a way? Did I get that right?
No,
Yeah.
you summarized that beautifully. And I think for me, I would even say that this is such an elegant system. It's such a beautiful, elegant system when, and I'm kind of nerdy. So when I look at all of the metabolic reactions and the enzymes and all the hormones coming together, it's really mind blowing how everything is so beautifully coordinated for our benefit. And I was also, just to take an even more macro view, when you think about life in general and our life, because, some of the folks who might be listening to this might be like, yeah, microbiomes, that's all well and good. I just want to be successful at my work, or I want to achieve the aims in my life, which is totally fine. And I would say, think about it. What provides you energy? And if you look at the connection, it's the energy from the sun that's trapped by the chloroplasts and the mitochondria in plant cells. So they're trapping that energy through the process of photosynthesis, transferring and converting that into food, into like sugars and proteins and fats, and vitamins and minerals. And these plants, we consume these plants, or the animals that we consume these plants. And then we take that food in, and then miraculously our body systems convert then that food back into energy resources. So in our human cells, we have mitochondria as well. So mitochondria are like the powerhouse, right? These are the energy generators of the cell that produce ATP, which is the currency of energy. And then it's this energy that allows us to then be alive and go out and do the work that we do in the world. So, I mean, there's such a primordial interconnection between us and the planet and the universe that I think is often missed. But to me, I find that incredibly fascinating. Wow, everything that I'm doing today, this energy has come from that food that was on my plate, and that has come from that soil that plant was grown in, that was influenced by the climate conditions around it. And so the health of that plant and the soil is directly relevant to how I show up in the world, because it's going to influence the quality of my energy, both my physical and mental energy. And here's a really cool fact. When you were talking about being a host to other microorganisms, I was in awe when, many years ago, I discovered that the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, so the chloroplasts is a part of the cell, plant cell that is involved with photosynthesis, that traps the sun's energy, and they have mitochondria as well. Both those and the mitochondria in our human cells are actually ancient bacteria, the prokaryotic cells, which are very simple cells, millions and billions of years ago, that were incorporated into more complex multicellular cells, and then became the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. And so if you think about it, we owe our existence to these microbes at a very foundational level. So I think I like to think of us not just merely as a host, but we are,
symbiont in a way, it sounds like.
Yeah, we have a very, very close symbiotic relationship with these microbes. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. So let's step back. And so what does that mean for the person who says, okay, look, since March, I've gained 20 pounds because I've been sitting at home baking bread and doing not moving. And then the holidays came. Oh, no, who can say no to stuffing and mashed potatoes and all of that sort of stuff? And, what should that person, who may or may not be me, incidentally, think about?
Yeah. And I would say that I have a lot of empathy for folks who are trying to optimize their diet, because it's so confusing. Every day you read a different study about a particular macronutrient. And again, I would say focus on three things. One is, of course, how much you eat. So that's sort of a very simple way. So like your portion size, but more importantly, what you eat and when you eat it. So let's talk a little bit about what you eat. Now, I'm going to summarize years of research, and nutrition is a sort of very contentious field just because it's very hard to carry out double-blind, randomized controlled trials over long periods of time when you're dealing with food. And so this is a combination of the best, randomized controlled trials, but also observational and epidemiological studies. What we're finding, and this is based on a review article from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology that came out earlier this year. And they looked at what is the healthiest diet possible, and they landed on a pesco-Mediterranean diet, which means, when you think about what should I eat, I would say the research is overwhelmingly pointing to a plant-rich diet. So this means whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, extra virgin olive oil, and cutting out junk and processed foods as much as possible. And you can add seafood, especially seafoods that are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, and really minimizing meat and dairy and added sugars. So that's, in study after study, it's some version of this diet, some combination. And again, we have, I think it's important for people to realize that there is flexibility. There's a lot of freedom, even with these sort of broad principles of what to eat. And you can experiment with that and use a lot of flavor. But that's, in terms of what to eat, that's the most important diet. But also know that this diet, which is really high in fiber, is actually feeding that biodiversity of microbiome that you want in your gut. So that's really important as well. So including fermented foods is key as well. And then the third part, so we want to eat, reasonable portions. We know what to eat. And then when to eat is also very important. And this comes down to, again, the summary of the research is, if eating within a window of 12 hours, but hopefully 8 to 12 hours is the ideal time for eating. And the reason for doing that is, again, just going back to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, is this is called, this is one type of intermittent fasting. And what we know is that when we have any kind of caloric restriction, so when we restrict the number of calories that we eat, it's been shown to increase our lifespan. And so lots of experiments have now been done in animals and in humans as well. And what we're finding is that this kind of intermittent fasting actually optimizes our metabolism. So when we were talking about the circadian rhythms, all of those processes which are involved with decreasing inflammation in the body, increasing immunity, increasing the generation of mitochondria, optimizing the clearing up of the damaged cells that can be precancerous, for example. All of that is optimized when we eat within these windows of eating. And the narrower the window, so if you start with 12, but then if you go to 11, that's better. If you get to 9 and to 8, that's even better. So, yeah.
So that's interesting, because that's something I had never heard before. I mean, yes, a bit about intermittent fasting, but the idea that there's a window, and that the narrower the window, the better. The idea that one thing you mentioned to me in a conversation we had once is that any eating can provoke an inflammatory response. First of all, what's an inflammatory response and why is it bad? And why is it that eating creates this kind of immune process that can lead to disease? That seems kind of strange, right?
Yeah. So inflammation is just our body's natural response to any kind of toxin or injury. So think of, very basic example is if you cut your finger, it starts bleeding. You'll notice that it becomes red. There might be a little bit of swelling, and that is the body's immediate, our immune system detects the injury and it says, oh, there's been an injury. We need to heal this. And so different cells come into play, and that process of healing is that acute inflammation, which is good for us. So acute inflammation is important. It's necessary. It's a reason that we have a fever, for example, when we have an infection. That's again an indication that the body's immune system is in gear and is trying to fight the invader or the pathogen. Chronic inflammation, on the other hand, is what gets us into trouble. So this is the low lying. It's sort of the body's immune response trying to figure out what's happening. There are lots of, it's sort of this low dose chronic toxin or injury that's happening to our systems, mostly because of our lifestyles and the environments that we are exposing our body to. And so our system is chronically inflamed. Think about an immune system that constantly has to battle against these invaders or pathogens, if you will, and that sets you up for disease. So what we know is that when you have this kind of sustained chronic inflammation, that's the starting point for all of these diseases that I mentioned before. Now, when you think about taking in food, when we take in food, it has to be absorbed. It goes through many different processes, right? From the mouth all the way to the breakdown in the stomach, and then the small intestine, and finally being absorbed in the gut. And there, as I said, there are hundreds of thousands of metabolic processes that go on and the interactions with the microbiome. And this breakdown so it's an active process that creates waste products. And anytime you have this kind of metabolic reaction in the cell, it produces what are called reactive oxygen species. And these are just, oxygen with a charge to it. And this is also what's known as oxidative stress. So in the natural process of breakdown of fuel substrates to produce energy, we naturally produce these sort of reactive oxygen species. And they are, when they are reactive, meaning they can trigger that kind of inflammatory response. So it's necessary, but it's also happening all the time. And if we if you think about, there has to, again, coming back to that rhythm and that balance, our body is always trying to come back to that sense of rhythm and homeostasis between these anabolic processes that produce these reactive oxidative species and the repair and restorative processes that are actually the antioxidant process, which is taking those oxidative species and neutralizing them and repairing and removing the waste products. And so there's always that balance. So yes, every time we eat, we are actually triggering that inflammation. And I think, which is not to say that we shouldn't eat. It's just that eating within these windows makes a lot of sense, because again, you are kind of doing it at the time when the body expects to do it. So, one way to understand this is when it comes to that kind of intermittent fasting, or the reason to do it was, when we were hunter-gatherers, there was no guarantee of food. And so there were days when we were not able to eat anything. And it was precisely during those days that we still had to have the energy to go out and look for more food, but also be at sort of a peak level of cognitive health so that we could protect ourselves and protect our tribes. So our bodies are actually optimized to work even more efficiently during those fasting states. So I think just, it takes a second to get that. But then once you realize that, we also know that the genes that code for that kind of efficient metabolism during fasting they are conserved. We all have them in our body. The thing is, we're not turning them on because we are sedentary. We are eating throughout the day. We're eating for, I think on average, Americans eat for about 15 to 16 hours in a day. So we're not giving our bodies a break. We are, our sleep-wake cycles are really off balance. We are being exposed to light till late at night, bright blue light. And so we're not sleeping well. And then stress, which is sort of like this underlying factor, which again triggers that chronic inflammation that we were talking about, and the rise in our cortisol levels. So all of this is sort of disrupting our rhythms, but in that process, we are not tapping into that amazing those genes that have been conserved to optimize our metabolism and our health. We're not turning them on when we're living this kind of lifestyle. So I think the practical message for folks is to say, okay, I want to be able to tap into this amazing genetic information that I have. And I can start to do that by slowly, you don't have to do that all at once, but slowly trying to think about, okay, how can I sleep a little bit more in sync with the light way, the daylight and night cycles? How can I make sure that I'm eating, within this window and not, triggering this inflammatory process by eating beyond this window? How can I make sure that the foods that I have are actually fueling and feeding the good bacteria and the biodiversity, because those bacteria are really important for all aspects of my metabolism.
So because we don't actually create a situation where the body has to maybe struggle a little bit with in a way we're too rich, right? That we don't have to struggle in the sense of not have food intake. And so you're saying those genetic systems don't get activated. That would be the counterbalancing force to what we normally do with our bodies.
Exactly. Right. And all, studies on health and longevity show over and over again that it's this kind of acute adaptive stress that turns on these gene sets that increase both our health span and lifespan. So, and these stressors are things like intermittent fasting, like high intensity exercise, like saunas and like cold shocks, like being in like taking cold showers, for example. But also interestingly, low amino acid intake, which is like low protein intake. So which is an argument for eating less animal foods. So all of this, all of these are these short bursts of that kind of adaptive stress to the body that trigger those genes. And specifically, if you want to get technical about it, there are, the mTOR system and the AMP kinase and the sirtuins. These are the gene sets that are sort of triggered by these kinds of acute adaptive stress that lead to these better health outcomes.
So let's go through that list again, right? So first of all, it's really fascinating to listen to this from a dietary point of view. My background is in human development, and we know that people need some kind of challenge to really thrive, right? Mm-hmm. And that Piaget, the great Swiss child developmental psychologist, started out studying mollusks, and he found that mollusks who lived in calm environments were less adaptive than the ones that lived in kind of turgid environments, right, where the water was rushing or it was colder or whatever, and it was that stimulus of challenge that mm-hmm. provoked an adaptive response, right? In raising a child, I think about, God, am I like making my kid's life too easy in some way, right? And then how is it you create like spoiled children is like making their lives too easy and they don't really have kind of adaptive function, and but in any case, so what's that list you were talking about, these kind of shocks to the system, and you mentioned cold shower, right? Uh-huh. Why, which I know is kind of a big thing now, and like why, and in Japan, It's interesting how much of how many of these things, of fermented foods and all of that, cold showers, are really inherently part of Japanese culture traditionally. Like, you know, in Japan, you have this tradition of the cold bath, and you know, sticking your body in the cold bath. Like, why is that? Why is that helpful?
Yeah. So it's, and a lot of cultures, right? Like, I mean, there's a culture of fasting in India, for example. Fasting is a very normal practice. And so these ancient cultures, I think, were just really more attuned to the rhythms, and they may not have had the metabolic knowledge, but I think they had a very intuitive sense of what was good for their bodies. So any of these things that I mentioned, you know, whether it's the cold showers or the high intensity interval exercise or the intermittent fasting, this kind of shock to the system, again, sort of replicates these evolutionary conditions that we evolved in. And in the body, there, you know, some of the metabolic changes that start to happen are, first of all, there's a metabolic switch from using glucose or carbohydrates as our primary fuel source to fat. And this metabolic switch is especially important, for example, with intermittent fasting. You know, that's one of the key changes that take place. And with this switch, what happens is that you are, when you do that switch, you're mobilizing the fat from your fat cells, and it gets converted into free fatty acids, and triglycerides goes to the liver, and there it's converted into energy. And one of the breakdown products is ketone bodies or ketones. And these ketone bodies are really good substrates for energy. So fat, you know, when you burn fat, it's more efficient than burning glucose. It produces more energy per unit. But then the ketone bodies themselves act as what are called transcription factors for different genes. And like I mentioned, there are these three big sort of gene sets. One is mTOR, which is a mammalian target of rapamycin, which is a very complicated name, but it's basically the key regulator of protein synthesis in the body. So it's a kind of metabolic system that's always attuned to the levels of glucose and amino acids and fats in the body. And then it again sort of monitors that homeostasis of how much of those fuel substrates are converted into proteins. So it's the anabolic part. It promotes growth in the body. It coordinates with insulin and glucagon and other, you know, these and cortisol, these hormone systems to promote growth in the body. The other two systems are sirtuins and the AMP kinase systems, again, which are important for different aspects of metabolism. But the key thing that happens when you switch these systems on and off is, like I said, one, you're optimizing energy production, but very importantly, that balance between growth and repair is optimized. So you don't want to constantly have a lot of growth. You always want to make sure that the body is sensing when is it time to clean out, and this process is called autophagy. So in our mitochondria, but also in other parts of the cell, you have this process whereby you can think of it kind of like a recycling system in the cell. So it sort of goes around, picks up all the waste products, and recycles them into other parts that the cell might need, or gets rid of them. This is also the process by which you produce more mitochondria. So you increase the volume and number of mitochondria, which is something that you would want, because that just means that you're getting more efficient at using that energy source.
More mitochondria means more energy in the body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is also when these sort of gene sets are stimulated, you also get more of that. Remember that reactive oxygen species, that oxidative stress that is being produced. The antioxidant part of it, the part of our systems that go neutralize those oxygen free radicals is triggered as well. by all of these processes.
So the body can, so in my cold showering every morning, right? Like what is that actually doing then?
So it's the stress, it's creating a particular kind of stress. So it's the cold, the change, the drastic change in temperature is picked up by the immune system and our metabolic systems as well. This is not normal. This is a change to our homeostasis. And so that sort of detection of that change triggers these systems to be like, okay, we need to up our game right now because we are facing this stress. How can we become really efficient right now and make sure that we protect ourselves and we use all of the possible homeostatic processes to get back into balance?
That's so fascinating because, you know, the whole thrust of modern life, and especially around consumerism, is about the creation of comfort and ease, right? I mean, that is its dominant narrative. Like, how do we make your life more comfortable, convenient, easier? And I always tell my students, look, do not make comfort the goal of your life, because comfort is death. And what you're doing is like pointing out, showing or revealing the underlying biological reality of what happens when you make comfort death, right? Or when you make comfort the goal of your life, is that it creates this imbalance that eventually results in kind of disease processes, right?
I think you're spot on. I mean, exactly. Comfort literally in this case equates to death, because it sort of sets our system so off balance that, you know, our muscles now don't have the ability to detect, to be able to take in the glucose that you're putting in through your body, because the insulin sensitivity has gone down, right? And so our blood sugar levels rise, and that increased unregulated blood glucose then again triggers sort of the inflammation in the body that produces a thickening of your arteries that leads to heart disease and stroke. The unregulated sort of growth. So again, when you have that imbalance between the growth and the repair and restoration, it's this kind of unregulated growth, especially of damaged cells, that is a starting point for cancer. And then when it comes to the neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and so on, you know, one of the key factors is that we are not sleeping enough. And sleep is one of the most important times for this kind of recycling and waste collection from our cerebrospinal fluid, and removing, you know, sort of the waste proteins from our brain cells that accumulate if that doesn't happen. And yes, and underlying all of this is sort of our modern lifestyle, where it's just all about comfort, right? Like, how can I lay in bed and use my technology and not move anything, and, you know, have everything ordered in prime time at my doorstep.
Right, that's okay. So there's like 3 different pathways I want to go down now. Let me pick one, and then we're going to circle back to the other 2. One thing I want to talk about, something that we talked about a little bit earlier, but I want to kind of go into a deeper dive about, is the notion of gut bacteria, right? And there's now this whole, I think, a global, no pun intended, cultural renaissance around fermentation and fermented food. And in our house, we ferment all kinds of things, sometimes unintentionally, but a lot of it is intentional. So, and then that's connected to gut bacteria. And I was wondering if you could kind of give a 30,000-foot overview about, like, you know, what is gut bacteria anyway, right? Is that some more California bullshit that we have to now pay attention to? But you know, in Japan, fermented food and paying attention to that. I have a student who is very much, you know, his whole company is around looking at your gut bacteria and finding an optimal balance. And so in Asia, at least, this is not new. This is not a Silicon Valley fad, along with microdosing, but something that's been part of the culture for a long, long time, and something that it seems like, at least in the post-war years in the West, we've kind of lost touch with. And Can you say a little bit more about that? Like what is gut bacteria? Why should we care about it? What harms the gut? What does it do? How do we help it? And what are the things that we do to hurt it? And yeah, anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, gut bacteria are part of that microbiome that we talked about. So when we say microbiome, it's actually referring to all of the genetic information, collective genetic information of all of these microorganisms that live on our body. So they live in our skin, in our mouth, in our stomachs, in our gut. And microbiota refers to the actual organisms themselves. And so there's so much to say here, but so here's the fascinating thing that I think people need to keep in mind. As I mentioned before, we would not be able to survive without these microorganisms. That's number one. So they are essential for life. And we have evolved, our metabolic systems have co-evolved with these microorganisms. So we basically borrow their genetic information to produce proteins and other metabolic processes in the body. Now, the development of the microbiome is fascinating. So we develop, think of it like an ecosystem. So the first 3 years of life are essential. That's when the majority of what our adult microbiome is going to look like develops in the body. So those first 3 years are very important. And so where do we get these bacteria? You can think about like the fetus developing in utero and you're like, okay, where are these bugs going to come from? Well, what's been really interesting to note this is the study of the microbiome has picked up in the last few years. So it's still a growing science. But some of what we know is that they have detected microorganisms in the placenta and even in the fetus gut. So this sort of early seeds of the microbiome. And then during childbirth, the child picks up more microorganisms from the mother's vagina, from the mother's skin, and then the exposure to the air and the environment around us. So through all of these processes, we are now taking in the bacteria, fungi, viruses that start to colonize our skin, and obviously through the food that we eat, they start to colonize and grow in our guts as well. Breast milk is very important. 30% of our gut microbiome, that seed microbiome, comes from breast milk. And so what we're finding is that in our sort of modern lifestyles, cesarean section sort of reduces the child's exposure. Bottle feeding reduces a child's exposure. The use of a lot of antibiotics reduces, whether the mom or later on in the child reduces this exposure. And then what we're seeing concomitantly is a rise in the number of allergies, a rise in the number of autoimmune diseases. Even the autism spectrum disorder has been linked to this sort of, again, dysbiosis, this upset in the balance of the microbiome during these, the first 3 years of development. And then, of course, food. Food is the primary source, and especially the fiber in the food is really important for the growth and the diversity of these microorganisms. So if you can think of, then as we, and then throughout life, again, how we sleep, the amount of food that we have, are we getting ourselves exposed to natural environments? How much stress are we exposed to? All of these factors influence the growth and flourishing of certain species in the gut, versus if you're eating a lot of junk food, processed foods, they will actually kill off a lot of the useful species. And so when you think about your gut, your adult gut microbiome, most of the species, one of the most important ways that they help us is that they produce, when they digest the fiber, they produce something called short chain fatty acids. And these short chain fatty acids are the ones that, again, feed into all of those metabolic systems that we've been talking about. And so they help us to digest our sugars and our fats and our proteins more efficiently. But very importantly, and this is especially in our early life, our microbiome educates our immune system, which is fascinating. So this microbiome really educates and informs our immune cells on how to behave and how to respond. And again, to your point of that kind of adaptive stress, builds the repertoire of the immune system, so that later on in life, when we're exposed to pathogens, we sort of have a strong immune system.
Wow.
And then sorry.
So it's a kind of biological capital you're given, kind of
Absolutely.
through birth, before birth, at birth, and as you said, your first 3 years of life, and then that biological capital builds the foundation for the functioning of your immune system, through your cognition and all of that.
Exactly. And we're also finding more and more that there's this gut-brain axis, right? So we communicate from the communication from our brain to our gut is through the vagus nerve, but then we also have in the gut epithelial lining sort of nerve endings that are attuned to these metabolic products of the bacteria. And so you have a two-way system. So what you eat, in other words, informs how you feel because of the changes that are taking place in the metabolites of the gut microbiome. Another thing to keep in mind is that 90% of the serotonin that we produce is produced in the gut epithelial cells. 40% of, or 40 or 50% of our dopamine is produced in the gut. And so when we, there was the recent study that showed that changes in our gut microbiome actually inform the amount of endocannabinoids that are produced in our brain. And those reduce in people who are depressed. And so we're beginning to see these correlations between the changes in the diversity, but also in the metabolites that these that the gut microbiome produces, linked to anxiety, depression, mood disorders.
So if somebody's experiencing, as you said, feeling depressed or feeling anxious, there might not be something psychologically wrong with them. It could be that they're eating things that then produce this experience in the mind.
Yeah, I would say, for any kind of disorder, my inclination is always to take a look at the whole system. So there's usually more than one factor, but hopefully the message that I'm getting across is that everything is linked together. Nothing works in a silo in our body. And so any one part of the system that you shift, it sort of upsets the whole balance. And then, but then that's also good because you can put that back into place as well. So yes, definitely, I think some people who might be experiencing mood disorders need to take a look at, am I sleeping enough? Because when you don't sleep enough, that produces that imbalance in your microbiome as well. What is the food that I'm eating? Am I eating a lot of junk foods and processed foods or sugary foods? Am I eating at like 2 a.m. in the morning because I'm feeling so stressed? Or am I eating within that window that we discussed?
It's interesting. I had a rare indulgence of eating an entire bowl of ramen 2 weeks ago, and I felt absolutely miserable for the next 48 hours. It was clear, like I felt like a zombie, and I thought, oh, I have just done something to my body that I probably shouldn't have done.
So there was one. So it's really fascinating because the sensitivity of our cells to our hormones changes so quickly, and it's so fine-tuned that just small disturbances have a huge impact. So for example, in the night, the reason that we say that you should eat sort of your heavier meals in the daytime and not do that later on in the evening is because, again, the circadian rhythm, melatonin, it's the hormone that sort of starts to make you drowsy and go to sleep. And melatonin levels go high when it's darker outside in the evening, but there are melatonin receptors in the pancreas, and the pancreas produce insulin. and they inhibit insulin production. So in other words, in the evening, when melatonin levels rise, it means that the ability of your pancreas to produce insulin decreases. In other words, your insulin sensitivity decreases in the evening. So the same food, that same bowl of ramen that you would have eaten in the afternoon, when that was not the case, when that spike of sugar in your blood from your bowl of ramen would have instigated an appropriate insulin response and would have been metabolized efficiently, that same bowl in the evening, it's a very sluggish response, which then has all of the downstream effects. So it's
so fascinating. So again, it's like not just what you eat, but when you eat it. So what are foods that damage the microbiome, and what are foods that help it? We had to think about it from a really practical level.
Yeah. So this is the most wonderful realization, is that the foods that help your microbiome are the foods that help your heart health, are the foods that help your brain health, are the foods that help you to prevent all of these diseases. So it makes our life really simple. So, and it was just like what we had discussed before. So you need to minimize all the junk, sugary, the artificial sweeteners, which by the way have been shown to really upset the microbiome. So that's one thing you should completely avoid.
So that's sugar, fat, refined flours, refined carbohydrates.
Yes. So all of the processed foods, boxed foods, junk foods, deep fried foods. These are the things that we need to avoid, not just for the microbiome, but for all of our
the whole
system. But it also makes it easy, right? So it's not just like, you don't have to keep track of many different things. It's this one principle, eating whole foods. So filling up your plate with as many vegetables and fruits as you can, more on the vegetable side, whole grains, because again, these are foods that are loaded with fiber, and these gut bacteria love fiber. That's what they feed on. So you want to provide them with lots of that. And then legumes, all kinds of beans and peas and lentils. Nuts and seeds are really important sources of fiber as well, and a lot of vitamins and micronutrients. And then in very measured quantities, seafood. And by seafood, I mean things like, because you want to make sure that you're not overdosing on the mercury. So, smaller fish. So, the salmons and the trouts and the herring and the sardines. But they're also high in omega-3 fatty acids, which are, good fats that are important for our cell membrane lining and our metabolism and our brain health. And extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil. They contain polyphenols, which are really important antioxidants. So remember, you're producing those reactive oxygen species. You want the antioxidants to neutralize those effects. So these oils are really packed with those.
So no butter is what I'm hearing.
Yes, no butter. Yeah, so poly and monounsaturated fats over saturated fats. So things like butters and margarines and animal fat are very high in saturated fats. And these have been shown. So here's where gut bacteria and saturated fat really sort of they really collide. So one of the, and it's not just the saturated fat, it's also the animal protein itself. One of the metabolites that's produced by these gut bacteria is TMA, which is trimethylamine. And this is a product that's taken to the liver and oxidized to produce trimethylamine and oxide, TMAO. And again, this is something that people may have heard of in the popular media, but this is a highly inflammatory protein. And so that it sets up that process of inflammation and narrowing of your arteries, and it disrupts the microbiome balance in your gut as well. So this is a reason why saturated fats, especially animal fats and animal proteins, should be minimized.
So just for the record, right? Because there's, I think, also a lot of misinformation around saturated fat floating out there. Saturated fats are not good for you, right? It's not the idea, which, I think there's an idea floating out there that, oh no, all that was wrong, and you eat as much beef as you want, or eat as much red meat as you want, and you're going to be okay. But that actually is not true.
Yes, and there were many flaws in sort of like the studies that came up that sort of raised this controversy. But on balance, after all of the reviews of those studies were done, the net is that we need to really minimize the intake of saturated fats. An increase in intake of saturated fats increases all-cause mortality which means, things like heart disease and strokes and cancer and so on.
And so then what about like artificial butters or vegan butters or something like that? I think I remember reading somewhere saying like, no, you should really have natural fats as opposed to these contrived things. But is that true too? I mean, that would be.
So I'm curious what you mean by vegan butters, but if you mean like nut butters, so nut butters are really healthy, but again, you have to look at how processed are they. So I think, just because something is vegan doesn't naturally make it healthier. You always want to make sure that it's minimally processed. And the closer it is sort of to its whole food configuration, the healthier it will be. Because you can, potato chips are vegan and
Right.
lots of other junk food is vegan.
Darn, I thought I might get around that rule there. But so that's quite fascinating. And then in the order of badness, like red meat, not kind of the worst for you, but then also I hear like chicken necessarily isn't it may be relatively better, but in the end, not that helpful.
Yeah. So I think, so all kinds of meat, what we are finding, and I think this is sort of a good segue into the discussion around how what we eat, what's on our plate actually influences the health of the planet as well. So when we look at most of, how our meat, whether it's chicken, it's pork, it's beef, most of it comes from factory farming. And I think we're all sort of very familiar with sort of the horrendous conditions under which animals are raised, the fact that a lot of the times they're fed these antibiotics and other hormones. And again, I think by now the listener should be starting to think, wait a second, what is all of that going to do to my microbiome when I eat it? So it's, when we eat these foods, they are triggering that kind of chronic inflammation that we want to stay away from. It's perpetuating that dysbiosis in our guts that we don't want. But often, and especially in their processed forms, right? So red meat, especially like bacon and all the cold cuts and processed forms of it is especially inflammatory. But then also thinking about sort of the planetary part. So what is this doing? I think a good exercise for people is just the next meal that you have to take a look at what's on your plate and sort of figure out, what is the percentage of like the high fiber foods and whole foods versus the processed and the junk foods, and just, take stock of that. But then start to think about, where did this food come from? Where was it grown? Like under what conditions? And what impact did it leave on wherever the food came from?
We're going to put a bookmark on our conversation with Parneet for now. And next episode, we will shift into a deeper conversation around how personal health and planetary health are intimately interconnected. Join us then. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a review and tell us your thoughts. The best thing you can do is share this with someone who might find it interesting and helpful. If you have an idea for other topics you'd like to explore, please let us know. Contact me at info@jeremyhunter.net. Again, that's info@jeremyhunter.net. Finally, thank you to the multi-talented Mr. Jason Beck for making the magic happen behind the scenes.